Sure. Great. So my name is Stewart Levine, and it's a pleasure to be with you today. We're going to talk about collaboration. We're going to talk about the critical aspects of collaboration. And more specifically, we're going to talk about collaboration and building high-performance teams. It's something that is just essential, no matter whether you're working in the for-profit world, for government, in the nonprofit world. Anytime you're involved in an organization in today's context, being able to collaborate effectively is really critical. And what we're going to talk about today, we're going to talk about the why, the what, and the how. And specifically, the first thing we're going to talk about is the why. Why is collaboration so essential in the universe that we're all working on today? Why is collaboration? Why is connectivity? Why is getting the benefits of each other's ideas just such a critical thing in today's universe? Well, Tom Friedman said that the world is flat, and in truth it is. The context that we're all operating in today with the advent of technology is a very, very flat world, a very, very reduced world, a smaller world. And critically, we're in a context of globalization. When I say globalization, I don't mean just in terms of large multinational business organizations, but many of the nonprofits operating in the world are working in a global context. Government constantly working together. Extra government agencies like the UN and the World Bank are all working in a global context. And essentially, what that means is that more and more people are working in distributed teams. We're not co-located. You know, years ago, when I started working in the workplace in the 1970s, people were face-to-face more often than not. All the technology that we take for granted today did not exist. So the idea of meeting with a group of people was always a face-to-face or an airplane ride. But today, it's nothing to think of a global team. I remember a story a number of years ago. A senior manager at HP told me she coined the phrase the virtual happy hour. The virtual happy hour, and it's true. And that's kind of an example of the whole notion of distributed teams. People are located in different parts of countries, different parts of the globe. And we need to be prepared to be working in that context. So distributed teams. Now, how we interact, how we produce, how we collaborate has really changed significantly over the past 15, 20, 30 years. And that pace is accelerating. In today's universe, we have an awful lot of well, I like to call them connectivity tools, even though vendors call them collaboration tools. And the reason that I say that is because connectivity puts people together. Collaboration happens as a result of human interaction of various kinds. And that's really where we're going to drill down into today. So a lot of things that are passed off as collaboration are really connectivity, because the human aspect of working together with other people is the critical piece. We have much less face-to-face communication today. As I said, people located virtually, people working within the same company, working within the same city. Many people are kind of, working not at the main location, but are telecommuting. So much less face-to-face, which means the connections we have with others have less bandwidth. But the mantra in the world of work is collaborate or die, really is critical. If you think about the old way of producing, it was kind of an assembly line. Each person separately did their individual task, and then it went on to the next person. So people didn't really collaborate. Today, when we think about the world of work, when we think about knowledge workers, we think about multiple people kind of engaging together at the same time to produce something. So research and development, marketing, sales, finance, all working together on the same product or service. And the same thing is true in the government or the nonprofit world. So we're literally working together. But we must collaborate or we kind of die. All right? So let's talk a little bit about high-performance teams and some of the critical aspects that we need to be mindful of. Now, one of the things, and it may seem strange that in a program about collaboration, I'm going to talk about conflict resolution, but it really is critical. In some ways, collaboration and conflict resolution, two sides of the same coin. Why? Because when we work with other people, no matter how clear we are at the beginning in terms of what we're doing together, no doubt differences and conflict will arise. And if you don't have the capacity to move through differences and conflict, you don't really have the capacity to collaborate effectively because you're not able to have what I call those real conversations, those difficult conversations where you can kind of resolve the differences so you have clarity about what it is that you're doing together. So, in order to kind of build a business case for doing that, one of the things we have to be aware of are the costs of conflict. And I say that there are four kind of distinct different parts of the cost of conflict. Number one, there's a direct cost. If you get into any form of conflict with people that you're working with and you can't resolve it simply, you've got to kind of bring in an outside facilitator to help. And so that's one of the direct costs of conflict. Even if it's someone from within your organization, someone from the HR department, a facilitator on staff, some third party to help you move through the differences in conflict. And there's a cost to that. Number two is productivity cost. Productivity cost. When we're in a conflict that kind of grabs us emotionally, and by the way, inherent in the definition of conflict is when you're blocked and cannot move forward where you want to go. So there's an emotional cost that ends up impacting the productivity cost. Think about the last time that you were sitting behind your computer screen and all you could feel is the smoke coming out of your ears. How productive were you that day? How productive were the people that were involved in the conflict? How long did that continue? If you attribute everyone in the organization to an hourly rate and you start to add those numbers, it gets very quick, very fast. So that's one aspect of productivity cost. Another one is if you think about conflict happening in the past, and until it's resolved, you keep moving it forward and bringing it into the present, you're literally incurring productivity costs every single day. Think about a manager's position. A manager's position who's supposed to be engaged in process improvement. If a manager is dealing with yesterday's conflict, they're not being able to engage in process improvement. They're not going to be able to engage in new development. And when you think about that, the opportunity cost can start to get really big. Continuity cost. A lot of work that goes on in organizations is based on ongoing relationships. When those relationships break down, you lose something. You lose institutional knowledge. You lose the ease of working with people that we're familiar with and the level of trust. And the last element is the emotional cost. Think about how that emotional cost can be big and how that can get in the way. Think about people that spend a chunk of their lives being angry about something that happened to them yesterday. So I've mentioned cost of conflict as a way to give us a little bit of justification for developing skills and knowledge and getting good at moving through conflict. All right? So, one of the other aspects of cost is miscommunication. All right? When miscommunication prevents ongoing dialogue and collaboration, you get distrust, you get turnover, you get passive-aggressive behavior, you get reduced quality, you get people operating and retreating into their silos, and you get, obviously, a level of decreased customer satisfaction. So, cost of conflict, cost of miscommunication, all tell us and point the way towards how essential it is to resolve and get to the place where you're comfortable dealing with conflict. Fact is, conflict is natural. It is neither positive nor negative. It's just kind of the way things are when we try to operate with other human beings. It really is an interference pattern of energies, and nature uses conflict in many different ways to create lots of beauty. One of my favorite examples of this is a place called Monument Valley in the Four Corners in the Southwest, Utah, Arizona, New Mexico, and Nevada, where they come together, Four Corners. Monument Valley are these beautiful outcroppings of rock produced by geophysical forces that were in conflict. So when we can move through conflict effectively, we can turn something negative into something very positive. We get much better results, and that's why it's real important to get good at moving through differences and conflict. It's not a question of whether we have conflict, it's a question of what you do with it. Winning and losing are great goals for games, but not for conflict. And we adapt that mindset very readily. We think about who's going to win the next ball game. We think about whether we're going to win that promotion. But that's not a very good mindset to bring into the context of moving through conflict so that you can collaborate effectively. Moving through conflict is rarely about who's right, but it really is about unhinging the belief systems we have and reframing what's going on so that we can come up with something better. Now, let's talk a little bit about where conflict comes from. Let's talk a little bit about the sources of conflict. All right? So, I like to think that conflict comes from four different sources: different observations, different interpretations, different feelings, different needs. The reason I'm talking about this is because what I want you to walk away with is what I'll call the normalization of conflict as human beings working together. Different observations. Two people looking at the same automobile accident can see different things. I had that experience when I first started practicing law many years ago, and I thought my client was telling the truth. Well, when the other driver talked about how the accident happened, I had the sense that they were telling the truth also, even though it was a different story. So, interesting. Different observations, different interpretations. How long is a short meeting? There you go. That's the kind of thing that could get us into trouble. Feelings. People show up with different feelings in different situations. Now, a feeling that we have in response to a situation is based upon our previous history. Now, if you have multiple people with different histories, their feeling sense is going to be different. That certainly can lead to conflict, and there's no such thing as a wrong feeling. Different needs. Everyone has different priorities. So if you look at these four vectors, and this is kind of very basic, there are many others also, such as communication style, such as prior relationship history with a certain individual. But if you look at these basic things, you can see that conflict happens. All right? Great slide that illustrates the high cost of conflict is a king mentoring his young son. And he's saying to his young son, "You have much to learn, my son. You cannot say on with his head after you've said off with his head. So critical. That is in great part about how we communicate with others, how we want to respond as opposed to reacting. Now, high value of collaboration, very high value. All right? There's a study done just before the great software tool, what Microsoft called a collaboration tool, SharePoint, was released. They commissioned a study. And the study demonstrated that collaboration is a key driver of performance. It's twice as significant as market opportunities, meaning opening up new markets, and it's 5 times as significant as market environment, meaning levels of competition. It has a direct effect on the gold standard by which organizations, for-profit organizations, are measured, and that is productivity and cost and sales. So collaboration is kind of a very, very critical competence. Now, as I've said before, conflict resolution, collaboration, 2 sides of the same coin. Now, it requires a certain set of skills. Let's take a break, okay? Mm-hmm. All right.
Okay, we're rolling whenever you're ready.
So as I said, conflict resolution and collaboration, 2 kind of sides of the same coin. So let's talk about some of the critical things that getting good at resolving and preventing conflict require so that we can collaborate effectively. All right? It asks of you, okay, that you become an emotionally intelligent, conscious communicator that values collaboration. It asks that you have a good grounding in what I call resolutionary thinking. That you become really good at crafting agreements for results which create a shared vision for you. And it really requires your willingness to change behavior. So we'll drill down into all those things in a moment.
Okay. And we're rolling.
Great. So let's talk a little bit about the what. What are the critical skills, the critical competencies necessary for collaborating effectively? So if you look at this as kind of a holistic approach, it requires 3 things. We need to pay attention to the people that are working together, the process that they're using, and the technology that hooks them together. So I said earlier that we've got to become conscious communicators, and that's kind of a critical skill that everyone needs to have. You can't take back words once they come out, so reaction is kind of not a real good thing to do. You've got to learn how to respond, and that requires a certain level of emotional intelligence. Now, we hear that term a lot in today's world of work, emotional intelligence. Many organizations are hiring not so much for technical skills, not so much for cognitive ability, but for emotional intelligence. Emotional intelligence. People who are good at connecting and working with others, playing in the sandbox well with the other people you're working with. So what is emotional intelligence? Well, it consists of having a great level of self-awareness, what's going on inside you at any moment in time. Self-regulation, your ability to control your behavior. Self-motivation, what's important to you. This is kind of the strategic component and your capacity to go after it. Empathy, care and concern for other people. My favorite statement is a quote from the poet Longfellow. If you knew the secret history of those you would like to punish, you would find a sorrow and suffering enough to disarm all your hostility. And good social, interactive communication skills as being kind of critical in this area. Right? There's that phrase, okay, that quote from Longfellow. Very, very powerful. I actually use that as part of my email signature. So let's talk a little bit about what I call my communication toolbox, kind of the very shorthand, some critical pieces. Recognizing differences. Even though we're speaking English, even though we're in Western dress, we have different operating systems. We're wired a little differently. And when you try to communicate sometimes, a lot of people communicate to themselves. They don't understand how important it is to flex to meet the style of the person that they're trying to get a message into. We want to respond and not react. We want to use I messages, speaking from our own as opposed to speaking to the you and blaming other people. We want to use an effective design piece in messages. You know, I call it the no feel do model. When we're delivering messages, we want people to do something. Great. People are motivated by a feeling. So how do we need to make them feel? And if you got the feel and the do, it'll tell you what you need to share by way of information, what they need to know. Never bark back at barking dogs. In other words, you want to de-escalate as opposed to escalate in the communication process. Provide effective feedback for people. Share your observations of what they're doing well and what they're not doing well. You want to create real relationships. Martin Buber wrote a book called I Thou, in which he talks about subjective relationships, and he compares those to object relationships. You want people not to be objects, you want to get to know them, the people that you're collaborating with. That's kind of just a critical tack to take. But the most powerful tool that we have in the context of collaboration is listening. Absolutely critical. Now, another thing we need to bring is resolutionary thinking, the mindset that we bring to our work with other people. Some critical things that are part of resolutionary thinking. Why is it resolutionary thinking? Because when you write a book, you get to make stuff up and you get to label them, and you're seen as an authority. So resolutionary thinking. Abundance. There's enough for them and me. Creativity. Making sure that we kind of have good conversations so that we collaborate effectively, so that we can find the best solutions for you and me. It's not you or me, it's you and me. Making sure you take people's feelings into account. Think long term. Disclose. Get everything on the table. And what you want to make sure that you do in these situations is see the process of one of teaching and learning and teaching and learning and teaching and learning, where we're sharing our perspective so that other people can be aware of it. Sometimes things come up that we didn't think of, and it's critical to be open to their influence, not to enter into this conversation with the perspective of winning, but the perspective of learning. Critical piece. Now, one of the other things that we need to be good at is having a mind map of the process of moving through differences and conflict. I call this a cycle of resolution. And let me just kind of move through it quickly. And there are three critical action steps. Number one is telling stories and getting information out so that everybody knows the perspective of others. Number two, getting current and complete, which is a way to deal with the emotion of conflict, because otherwise that'll come back to bite you when people have powerful and strong attached emotional feelings. And creating a new agreement for the future. The best way of preventing conflict is to begin any new collaboration with a very, very clear agreement about what you're doing together. So, beginning new collaborations. The law of agreement. The law of agreement essentially says that when we collaborate with others, we do it by having agreements, implicit or explicit. Most of us operate with implicit agreements, and we end up in trouble because we had different understandings. The way to collaborate effectively is to have a clear, shared vision, a very, very explicit agreement of where it is that you're going together. So at the beginning of any new collaboration, what's critical is to have your intent and vision clear, the roles that each person is playing, the promises, what does each person take by way of responsibility that they will do, the value that each person is going to get, because if people don't perceive they're getting value, performance goes down. How will they measure whether or not they were successful, the metrics? Concerns and fears stated on the front end so people can respond to those. Renegotiation. We know what we know at the beginning. We don't know what we don't know. We find that out as we're working together. And it's real critical to be able to renegotiate our promises, renegotiate the vision that we have. Consequences. What happens if people don't keep promises? What happens if we don't get to that vision? What are the consequences to the individuals involved, to the organization, to the community that people are trying to serve? How are we going to move through conflict? Because we know that it happens. And do we have a clear agreement? Are we on the same page with each other? So, in the great words of Helen Keller, alone we can do so little, together we can do so much. I'm going to talk a little bit about the how of creating effective collaborations in a moment.
Okay.
Ready?
Okay, we're rolling.
Great. So let's talk a little bit about the how of this. Some of the critical things to be aware of. All right. As I've said, collaboration and conflict go hand in glove. All right. They're two sides of the same coin. What really is important is people's attitudes. You know, the slide you're probably looking at shows someone with their head buried in the sand. And probably about 60-65% of the public that I've dealt with has that attitude. They like to avoid conflict. They haven't yet embraced the idea that it's part and parcel of working with other human beings. So one of the first things I will, often ask people to do is, where'd your attitude come from? Is it serving you? And have you ever made a choice? And usually the response is people recognize and realize that it came from their family of origin. And that may not be the best training. Making a choice is to embrace differences as something that is just part of working with other human beings. Look at the culture, okay, that you operate in. What's the culture? Is it a culture where people are just nice to each other? Or do people have real conversations? I say in order to collaborate effectively, you've got to have those real and difficult conversations. Intel, pretty successful organization, has a culture of constructive confrontation. They have those difficult conversations. So culture really is kind of a fuzzy word. But when you think about culture, right? When you think about culture, culture is embodied in relationships. And relationships are kind of formed and structured by the spoken and unspoken agreements among people. And I say you can impact the culture of any organization, any family, any collaboration by making explicit the agreements of how we will interact with each other, using the agreement model that I mentioned. So some things that you might want to think about. What's the culture of your organization, of your primary relationships with your family, of the team you work in? What is the culture? What are the spoken and unspoken agreements within the organization, and how might you impact them? All right? What about agreements? Okay, what's the state of your agreements with people that you're trying to work with? What's the state of your agreements with your loved ones, with your significant other, with your organization, with your team, with your manager? What's the state of those agreements? And the reason I ask you that is because what I have found over time is that when there is conflict, it's usually an ineffective, an incomplete, or a non-existent explicit agreement. So I mentioned earlier the laws of agreement, and remember the laws of agreement say that we collaborate in language. We create agreements. Most of us, when we were very young, never learned what to put into a good explicit collaborative agreement. And it's essential to be able to do that. The more we practice creating great agreements at the beginning of any collaboration, the more powerful the collaboration gets and the better we get at crafting agreements. So many times when people start to use explicit agreements, they think it's like they have discovered sliced bread. So I suggest that you start and practice, all right? Good agreements and all of the skills that we've talked about create powerful collaborations. So, some actionable ideas for you, all right? Value differences. Develop your emotional intelligence. Allow the experience of what it is that is created between you and another person to emerge and surface. Foster the contribution of each person's natural genius as part of the collaborative process. Build shared vision through the agreement process. Embrace resolutionary thinking and realize that communication is both verbal and nonverbal. You've got to kind of embrace the resolution process and have those difficult conversations. It takes a level of courage sometimes, but kind of it's critical to do that. If you kind of follow the suggestions, which are more like introductions that I have just shared, your collaborations will be much more powerful and your results will be much more powerful. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Okay, and we're